sometimes my mum, sometimes my grandma take me, my big sister, and my three brothers down to the pierhead. And what would we do at the pierhead? We'd get on the ferry. Now, nowadays you go on the ferry, you go up and down the river and the tourist route. But when I was a kid, the ferry actually took you all the way to New Brighton. And there you get off on the pier, and you walk along the pier, all the sights, the smells, the sounds. There'd be the fairground rides, selling all the pop music of the time. I seem to remember like a long, low room with the smell of smoke coming out, the penny arcade machines, and with the smell of the food, the chips, the candy floss, and the hot dogs. But when I was a kid, my mum and my grandma would take our hands and we'd walk right through without stopping, because in those days we didn't have much money. And then we'd walk onto the front, and there's New Brighton Lighthouse, and next to the lighthouse is Four Perch Rock. You've been there, haven't you? I've read Four Perch Rock in the New Brighton. When I was researching a story about to tell you, I found out that Four Perch Rock was built in 1826. But before it was built, and before New Brighton was built, that area was known as Black Rock. And our story features Black Rock. So we know the story is older than 1826, and most probably from the 1700s. But still, when Liverpool was a bustling seaport, and ships would go all around the world. Now, sadly, know about some ships would go down to Africa, all the way to the Caribbean, and back to Liverpool. Some ships would think all around the Mediterranean, and some ships, and we know this, would go all the way to the Arctic. Because in those days, Liverpool was a big whaling port. And the thing is this, if you were on one of those ships, you'd wait from Liverpool for months, maybe a year. And what would happen? Well, what happens is this, the ship's company become like your family. People you entertain with, people you sing songs with, people you eat with, even people you argue with, just like a real family. And the story starts when a ship came up the River Mersey and docked in Liverpool. And all the ship's company, they all came off, and they're all laughing and joking, but they're all going back to the real family and friends, all of them apart from one. Now he was tall, he was handsome, and he was young. He had black hair, a black beard, and a kind of melancholy about him, because he was sad, because he didn't have his family in Liverpool, and he was never in town long enough to form any firm friends. So what would he do? What would he do while he's waiting to join another ship's company? Well, what he'd do is this, he'd walk. Sometimes he'd walk all the way to Crosby, where the Ironmen are today. Sometimes he'd walk all the way to Hale, with a little lighthouse. And sometimes, and this was his favourite thing to do, he'd walk to the port of Liverpool, get in a ferry to Birkenhead, and do that long 4-mile walk on the foreshore to Black Rock. And one day, he was there. Now the sun was shining in the sky, seagulls were crying in the clean blue air, and the tide was slowly but surely swishing in. And the sailor lay down on Black Rock and went to sleep. And when he woke up with this funny idea. He woke up with this funny idea that he was being watched. He looked all around the rock. There was no one there, no one. But that feeling stayed with him. And then he looked down to the River Mersey. He couldn't believe his eyes. Because there in the River Mersey was someone swimming. Well, then as today, it's very unusual to see someone swimming in the River Mersey. It does happen, but it's unusual. This just wasn't anybody. This was a young woman, his age, with long flowing golden hair, a smile on her face, and a twinkle in her eye. He wondered what she was doing there. So he shouted down to her, "Hey, what's going on? Why in the river?" Said nothing. Carry on smiling at her. Can I help you? Still nothing. So we decided to walk down to the River Mersey to see what was going on. And as soon as he stepped into the water, she spoke to him. She said, I'm looking for my family. Well, that didn't make sense to him either. I mean, why would you look for your family in the River Mersey? It doesn't make sense, does it? But he was a nice guy. So he said to her, well, I hope you find your family, because I haven't got one. Then he started to tell her his story. About how as a boy he was grown up in the port of Liverpool. His father was a sailor and was always out to sea. But one time, he never came back. He drowned. So it was just him and his mum. And then when he got to the age of 14, his mum found it hard to make ends meet, and she died of cholera. So he's left on his own. But at 14, he was old enough to become a ship's cabin boy. So he joined the ship's company, and he loved being on the sea with ships, and he worked his way up. But when he came back to Liverpool and land, well, he was lost and lonely. And so he walked everywhere, and that's what he was doing on Blackpool. Well, she felt sorry for him, didn't she? I mean, you feel sorry for him, you're all right. So she decided to swim over to give him a hug. But as she did so, she did a little flip. And what did she have, ladies and gentlemen? What did she have? A tail, that's right, she had a tail. She started dancing to the music with the tail. No, she said, that's right, I'm a mermaid. And then she started to tell him her story about how her and her family were on a ship and was leaving the River Mersey. But the ship was hit by a squall, hit by a wind, and the ship sank, and everybody drowned. But because they were good people, because they had good souls, as the souls left the bodies, they turned into merfolk, mermen and mermaids, and they swim around the river as a family. But as we all know, the River Mersey is very muddy, so they lose each other from time to time. So that's what she was doing, looking for a family. But then she said to him, look, I've got to leave you now, but I still haven't found a family. And then she said to him, will you be here tomorrow? And what did he say? Yeah. Defo. He said, yeah, I'll be here tomorrow. So she disappeared off the muddy waters of the River Mersey. He came out, dried himself off as best he could, and started walking back to Birkenhead. But as we say around here, his head was buzzing. He was thinking to himself, I've met a mermaid. Oh, she's beautiful. She's got a family, and she wants to meet me tomorrow. And he realized he was going to fall in love with her. But before he knew it, he was back there. Got the ferry back to Liverpool, and as he's walking back to his lodgings, he happened to walk past a jewellery shop. Now he'd heard the stories on the ships about how mermaids like rings, so he decided to go and buy one. So he walked through the door, and there's the proprietor, the shopkeeper. He was pleased to see him, of course he was. Here's a young man, a sailor, money in his pockets. He pays his card right to get another sailing before the end of the day. But he took a liking to this young man, and when he found out he wanted to buy a ring, he explained to him, you've got a choice. You can either buy a new ring, or you can buy a second-hand ring. If you buy a second-hand ring, you get more for your money. So that's what happened. Out came the second-hand rings. And he quickly picked one out, for the colour of the stones with the colour of the sand in the sea. But he thought you'd like that one. Now, he gave the sailor a good price. But because it's a second-hand ring, it didn't come in a box. So he had to root around his counter and found a nice leather pouch. Put in the ring, along with the receipt. The sailor put that in his pocket and went back to his lodgings. The next morning, he was up Brighton early, went down on the ferry to Birkenhead, and then his long way to Blackpool. Once again, the sun was shining in the sky, seagulls were crying in the clean blue air, and the tide was slowly but surely swishing in. And he lay down on Black Rock, but this time with one eye. Sure enough, the mermaid with the long flowing golden hair swam. He got up, walked down into the river. She lifted up her hand, took his, and said, "Come with me and meet my family." And the pair of them disappeared into the muddy waters of the River Maid. Now later that afternoon, a funny thing happened. A really funny thing. Because two fishermen were walking across Black Rock. He got to the edge. The tide had gone out. But there, lying on the sand, was the body of a sailor. Black hair, black beard, a smile on his face, but he was dead. He wondered who he was, how he got there. So they went down onto the sand and started looking through his body, trying to find any clues for a name or address, but they didn't find anything. But they found something very unusual. They couldn't work it out. Because there in his pockets was a leather pouch with a receipt for a ring, but no ring. There should be a ring here, they said. There should be a ring. But I think some of you know where that ring was. But where was it? That's right. It was on the finger of the mermaid. And she was swimming with a new merman boyfriend, with a family all around them, with smiles on their faces and twinkles in their eyes. And it could be said that they lived happily ever after. But I say that for a very particular reason. Because I heard it said, in fact, it couldn't get a day off my packet. It's a nice day like today. And if you go to New Brighton, and if you stand by Four Perch Rock, which you know used to be Black Rock, and if the conditions are right, you know what I mean, of the sun shining in the sky, the seagulls are crying in the clean blue air, and the tide is slowly but surely swishing in. And if you're very, very lucky, and you squint into the dazzling water of the River Maid, you might just see two heads bobbing. But people might say to you, "Oh, don't believe Andy and his stories. That's a load of rubbish. That's just the seals. That's just Atlantic grey seals come back to the River Maid." But what I say to you is this: who has ever seen a seal with long flowing golden hair? And who has ever seen a seal with black hair and a black beard? And that's the end of the story.